I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our speaker for tonight, Dr. Adrian Burke. Dr. Burke is a professor of archaeology at the University of Montreal, specializing in pre-contact archaeology of northeastern North America, specifically lithic technology and the raw materials used to make stone tools. He studies the quarries where people extracted the raw material and how they were exchanged among indigenous groups at the time. In today's talk, titled Lithic Sourcing for Late Paleoindian Sites in Southeastern Quebec and Links to Vermont, Dr. Burke is presenting recent research on the geologic sources of the material used to make stone tools at 3 late Paleoindian sites in southeastern Quebec: Pleistocene, Gaudreau, and Kruger II. The sites are located in the eastern townships of Quebec, close to the Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine borders. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Burke.
Thanks, Yvonne. It's nice to be here. Nice to be with my friends and colleagues from Vermont. I love Vermont. Unfortunately, I can't go there right now, but hopefully I'll be allowed to go soon. So I'm just gonna start my timer here so I can stay on track, and I'll share my screen with you. And hopefully that'll go to the full screen. And I'm hoping that everybody can see that well. And if there's any problem, I guess, Randall, you just tell me. Good, okay. All right, so tonight I'll be talking about 3 sites. I don't know why I'm already on this slide. I'm sorry about that. I'll be talking about 3 sites in southeastern Quebec that are late Paleoindian sites that I've been working on. I've been analyzing the stone tools from these sites. Okay. Just a quick outline of what I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on chronology and environment. Then I'll just a very quick word on how archaeologists can figure out that a stone tool comes from a specific place. In other words, the raw material, the rock, where it comes from. Geologically or geographically, and how it moved over large distances in some cases. Then I'll give 3 examples from 3 different sites in southeastern Quebec, and then at the end I'll just sort of mention a couple of conclusions or implications for Paleoindians in this area of southeastern Quebec, but of course Vermont and northern New York, northern New England, excuse me. All right, so quick word on chronology. So for those of you who don't know the Paleoindian too well, these are sort of the newer dates being used nowadays. So in the Paleoindian in the Northeast, especially in the area of Quebec and northern New England, what's called the Middle Paleoindian is roughly from 12,200 to 11,600 years before present calibrated. Then there's the late Paleoindian, and which can be split into 2 parts, 11,600 to 10,800, which would be the earlier part of the late Paleoindian, and then a later part, which is 10,800 to 10,000 years BP, again calibrated. So I'll be talking about 3 sites. They're called Pleistocene, Kruger II, and Gaudreau. They're all very close to each other. I'll show you a map. Pleistocene is the only site in Quebec to date that has fluted points on it. And they are called Michaud or Neponset style points. And these are dated to the Middle Paleoindian based on their style, the style of the point. Then Pleistocene also happens to have a later component, which is dated to the late Paleoindian. And it has what's called agate basin type forms on it of bifaces and points. And then the site of Kruger II also has some of these agate basin type bifaces or points. And then into the later part of the late Paleoindian, we have Kruger II, which also happens to have this later component, what's called St. Anne Varney points. I'll show you examples. And then the Gaudreau site. So we kind of have a sequence here. Pleistocene that takes us from the Middle Paleoindian into the beginning of the late Paleoindian. Kruger II, which overlaps into the earlier part and the later part of the late Paleoindian, and Gaudreau, which is limited to only the later part of the late Paleoindian, roughly 10,800 to 10,000. So the points we're talking about are like this. So the ones that they call agate basin or agate basin style are these on the left, A and B. These are from further west, so they're more larger, perhaps more perfect points. We call them agate basin like because they kind of look like them, but they're not exactly perfect matches. And then we're talking about these other points on the other end of the late Paleoindian, which are parallel flight points that are referred to as St. Anne or Varney points, St. Anne for Jasper site and Varney farm site in Maine. And then in between, there's different types like Daltons and high-lows. In Quebec, just as a note, we basically don't have these types, with the exception of maybe one high-low that I've seen in Gaspé at La Marthe and one possible high-low point on the Richelieu River, actually very close to the Vermont border, New York border. Okay, just a little bit about the environment. So we're talking about this area of southeastern Quebec. And of course, here is Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. And the sites we're talking about are these three here, Kruger II, Gaudreau, and Clichy-en-Cour. And as you can see, based on this reconstruction of the ice front, by 13,000 years, these sites are already clear of the ice, and by the time they're occupied, which is about 11,000 years ago, the ice is quite far away on the other side of the St. Lawrence. And at that time, around, let's say 11,000 years ago calibrated, there is, instead of the Champlain Sea and instead of the St. Lawrence River, there's something in between that we call the Lampsacus Lake, which is mostly freshwater, and you can see the outline of it here. So it's kind of like a remnant of the Champlain Sea. It's not quite the St. Lawrence, but you can see that these people here are on the St. Francois River, and that is actually backing up here earlier on, and then eventually it empties out into the Lampsacus Lake. But like I said, by the time these sites are occupied in the late Paleoindian, the ice is pretty far away. In terms of the environment, in terms of, for example, the forest cover, if we look at the late Paleoindian period again, and we look at the area we're talking about, which is roughly here, the St. Francois River and the Megantic area, that's where the sites are. Essentially what this graph, this pollen cords tells you, or palynological sequence tells you, is that during the late Paleoindian, so for example, when Kruger II and Clichy-en-Cour are occupied, we're already into what's called the afforestation phase, which means there's already forests that are starting to replace the tundra, but these can be pretty open forests. They can be spruce parklands or open fir woodlands. And then in the later part of the late Paleoindian, so when Kruger II and Gaudreau are occupied, you're into pretty much closed forests, as you can see down here. So anything from a fir forest to possibly even some sugar maple forest already in place in some parts of the eastern townships in that southeastern Quebec. So there are already forests, and they're already starting to become more closed forests at this time. So it's not a tundra, it's not a taiga, it's definitely already forested, especially in the valleys, of course. All right, so just quickly before we move into the rocks and how they move around, I just thought I'd say a word about how I do my work, because a lot of my work is actually more geological, and a lot of times, people wonder how it is that I know that a rock comes from a place and how do I analyze it. And basically what archaeologists do is we use a lot of analytical techniques that are borrowed from chemistry and physics and geology and all kinds of other sciences. And we call these archaeological sciences or archaeometry. And I spend a lot of my time doing this. And basically what I do is I do a lot of geological work first. So I'll go out in the field, I look at geological maps, and I kind of try and figure out where the outcrops are of rocks that might be interesting to me, that may have been used in the past by people to make stone tools. And I go to these outcrops and I study them. I take GPS locations. Then I take samples, samples across the beds. I look at it with the eye of of an archaeologist too, in the sense that I'm interested in knowing, you know, is this any good to make stone tools with, for example. Then I take the samples back to the lab. We have a comparative collection. I can make thin sections out of it and do what's called thin section petrography. I can do geochemical analyses. I have a X-ray fluorescence spectrometer lab, so I can do the analyses in-house to study the real geochemistry of these rocks. And then we can even go to things like scanning electron microscopes, even higher, you know, higher magnification. So there's a lot of techniques that we use to make sure that we know that a rock is from one place and is then found on the site where we find it eventually as archaeologists. Of course, these materials have to get from point A to point B. This is just a quick slide to show you that, of course, we don't know exactly how it got from the source to the site, but there's different ways of knowing. You know, there's obviously oral traditions, First Nations oral traditionals, trails, like this map of the trails in New Hampshire that some of you might have seen. We can use GIS to look at sort of like what's called least cost path analysis to go from, you know, the source to maybe a Paleoindian site. Anyways, but that's a lot harder to know really for an archaeologist, is, you know, how it got from point A to point B. So anyways, what I want to most basically talk to you about tonight is really examples of these 3 sites that I've been studying over the last few years. Kruger II is the one that I just finished, so but it's useful to sort of look at all 3. And so Clichancourt, Gaudreau, and Kruger II. So here's where they are. So obviously you folks are here in Vermont, possibly you're somewhere else, I don't know, because this is Zoom. And here's New Hampshire and Maine, and you can see the border right here. And as you can see, the sites are pretty close to the border, especially Clichancourt. They're all 3 quite close to each other as well. These 2 are on the St. Francis River. This one is more on the Chaudière and the Megantic, Lake Megantic watershed. And what you see here in the triangles are basically either known sources of raw materials to make stone tools, or ones that I've studied and could be potential sources. And I've also included here, you know, the entire Cheshire quartzite outcrops going down Vermont, Ossipee, that's the Ossipee ring dike, and, you know, other ones that you know probably pretty well, like Mount Kineo and Blue Ridge, Braswa, Munsungan, etc. So there's a lot of potential sources, and some of them even have quarries associated with them, but not all of them. Sorry. Okay, so let's start with Clichancourt because that is the oldest, and it's also an interesting site in that it has the fluted point component, as you can see here on the left, but it also has this unusual agate basin-like component, which Claude Chapdelaine associates with the late Paleoindian. And what's interesting is that, as you can see, most of this material is bifaces, and they're made out of Kineo-rhyolite, except the Kineo-rhyolite is heavily weathered. It's heavily weathered. And it's really a pretty significant change from the early or middle Paleoindian, excuse me, site, which has a lot of cherts, including Munsungan chert and other cherts, possibly from New York, and a series of other materials. When you go to Clichancourt, what happens is these people seem to focus almost exclusively on Kineo-rhyolite to make their large stemmed, usually bifaces that are typical of what we call agate basin like in the east here. The next site is Gaudreau. Now, I'm not in chronological order for a simple reason, and that is that this is the order that I've analyzed the sites, but it's also important to keep in mind that we're going from the sites, from 2 sites that have not as good a context to a site that has much better context. So basically, Clichancourt has middle and late Paleoindian, but the problem is that we can't really separate them out perfectly in the sense that they're not separated stratigraphically, they're somewhat separated horizontally, spatially, but there is definitely overlap at the site. So when you're studying, you can't be 100% sure that all the lithic material only comes from, let's say, the late Paleoindian. And the same is the case for Gaudreau, which is in the later part of the late Paleoindian. So here now people are making parallel flake points here. And again, Gaudreau is, unfortunately, it's a super interesting site. It has, as you can see, a lot of these points, these parallel flake points. The problem is that it's a site that has everything. It has everything from late Paleoindian right through the Archaic, right through to the woodland. And it is all mixed up in 30 centimeters of soil that's been trampled by horses and messed up. And unfortunately, again, it's a bit hard to separate out things spatially, either horizontally, and certainly not really vertically. So what we did, or what Claude Chapdelaine did in his analysis, was he basically took the materials that are definitely diagnostically late Paleoindian, like these parallel flake points, and separated them out. And what he found was that, again, these people were focusing a lot on one material, except in this case, they were focusing on an unusual material that we hadn't seen before. And this was kind of new to us. It was a bit unusual. We didn't know what it was at first. And the archaeologist, Claude Chapdelaine and Eric Graillon, called it a rhyolite. And at first I thought, yeah, maybe it's something like a ignimbrite, or, you know, some kind of welded tuff or something like that. But anyways, it was unusual and very easy to recognize. So I think that any of you who would see this and held it in your hand, you'd say, wow, I think I've seen this before. Where did I see it? Except we had never seen it before until it was found on the site at the Gaudreau site and associated only with the late Paleoindian. Okay, so that's two sites. And like I said, unfortunately, with those two sites, we can't really very, very reliably separate out only the late Paleoindian. So I thought I would focus primarily tonight on Kruger II. And the reason for that is that I have been able to analyze it, and I just completed the publication for that. And I've been able to look at all the tools more than once, and the debitage, and really get have a lot more time to look at it. And the other more important thing for our purpose is that we have, it's a site that looks like it's almost only late Paleoindian. Now it has those two possible earlier part of late Paleo and later part of the late Paleo, but this site is also stratified, so it does have some vertical separation and stratification, which allows us to have a better sense of what's early and what's maybe the earlier stuff and what's the later stuff. I'll be just talking about primarily the latter part of the late Paleoindian, so that parallel flake, those parallel flake points and what goes with them. So Kruger II is different. Kruger II is it's a very rich site. It has tons of projectile points and bifaces. And as you can see from this, there's quite a variability in the raw materials being used. So that's already a bit different than Clichy-Rancourt and Gaudreau. And apart from the diagnostic things like this, amazing point, I think was re-glued from 4 pieces, you have a lot of these retouched parallel flake pieces, but you also have an amazing array of tools, large bifaces, drills, tons of drills, a lot of drills, a lot of side scrapers. So the really very classic racloir, as we use the term in French, and something that's often really associated with the Paleoindian in the Northeast. And then scrapers, of course, there's scrapers. There's not that many scrapers, to be honest. Smaller scrapers. There's a lot more of these racloirs and really a lot of drills and bifaces and what we assume are projectiles. So it's varied in the raw materials, and it's got a lot more tools in terms of the variety of tools that you find. So it's a better sample, and we know that it's essentially later late Paleoindian. So St. Anne Varney or just that part of the late Paleoindian. So what I did is I looked at the raw materials, and because I have a comparative collection of raw materials from all the quarries in the Northeast, I was able to look at these sometimes just in magnification, just, 20, 30 times magnification. In some cases, we made thin section. I wasn't able to do geochemistry this time, unfortunately, for this site because my lab is closed right now. I was able to do it for some of the Kruger material, which was published, and then a few of the objects from Gaudreau, but nothing from Kruger, unfortunately. So mostly what I'm talking about is lowered powered microscopy. So what you have here is, for example, on the left, so here are some tools made out of what we think is kenyoriolite. And here's an image on the left of a geological sample. The reason it's different is because this is weathered. This is the artifact, it's weathered. And these are the feldspars that are weathered out. And these are these quartz beads, what we call quartz beads or little quartz eyes, sometimes they're called. They're basically little spherules of quartz. And so this is very diagnostic of kenyoriolite, and most of you who've worked on a site with kenyoriolite will probably recognize this. Unfortunately, the material, though, is very weathered. There's also a red sort of mudstone that we didn't know where it was from initially. We knew there was some cobbles in the river, but there were way too many large pieces that had blocky surfaces on them, so we knew that there must be a quarry close by. And it's a very important material at the site. I chose to call it a red mudstone because I thought it was really not silicious enough, but I think it's actually more silicified than I initially thought. And luckily enough, with a lot of good luck and with a lot of also help from a navigational archaeologist, Sylvain Rancourt, last year, me and Sylvain were able to find the first quarry of this material in the Eastern Township, in only 27 kilometers from Kruger II. So this is a real quarry. This is material from the quarry, flakes, and these are the tools from Kruger II. And the match is excellent. In fact, it's perfect. I've looked at it in higher power microscopy, and now I have some thin sections that I can start looking at, but I have no thin sections of the tools yet from Kruger II. So eventually we'll have to do that. But the match is very, very good. So that's great. We have a quarry. We have a good idea that it comes from there. You can see that a lot of this material is banded. So clearly banded, this is sedimentary layers, and you can see the banding very clearly in this red outcrop here from that quarry called Makwapskuk Rancourt. And Makwapskuk is the Abenaki name for red rock. Okay, moving along. Another material that's quite important is Hornfels. We don't hear a lot about Hornfels in the Northeast very often, but Hornfels is important. People who work in New Hampshire know that from the sites around Tamworth, Ossipee. And in Quebec, it's actually quite important too, but it's usually important in the late Archaic and into the woodland, primarily because people don't seem to really bother going too far to find raw materials, so they have it close by Montreal and the lower, basically in the St. Lawrence, the plain of St. Lawrence. It's about the only material you have, so that's what people use. But it turns out that at Kruger II, Hornfels is very important material. In fact, it's used a lot, and they managed to make absolutely incredible faces out of it, as you can see here on the right. Now, the thing about Hornfels is that it weathers very quickly. So within 500 years, this material, you can already have a hard time seeing the flake removal. Here you can see it's weathered out, but fortunately it's still in pretty good shape. And on the left here, you can see a sample from the quarry, the Hornfels quarry on Mount Royal, which is right in the middle of Montreal. It's a pre-contact quarry. And then this is an outcrop of a new source that I found this summer, just a few weeks ago, near Scottstown. I had been there before, but I hadn't found any good stuff. And this year I found some really good stuff. And I'll get back to that. Sorry. And then there's a whole bunch of other materials that some of you may know already. So obviously there's the Mount Jasper rhyolite that many of you are familiar with. Cheshire quartzite, of course, that everybody knows in Vermont. But these are materials that are present in very, very small numbers. So Mount Jasper, I think there's 2 bifaces and a big racroile, this one. Cheshire, I think there's a couple of biface fragments and maybe a scraper. And then in the cherts, there's a little more, and the cherts seem to be used primarily for scrapers, which is interesting, small scrapers. And then there's this material again, that really unusual material that we had found at Gaudreau for the first time, that we didn't know what it was. We called it a rhyolite. And, you know, we thought, man, what is this stuff? So again, you know, doing the same process, if you take these, this is a biface in Mount Jasper. You look at it, this is the weathered surface of the artifact. This is a fresh surface from the Mount Jasper quarry. These are the spherolites, these stringers made out of spherolites. This is an excellent match. So we know that this is from Mount Jasper. And then we have the Gaudreau rhyolite. Well, the Gaudreau rhyolite is very interesting. Like I said, at first I thought it was rhyolite. It turns out it probably isn't. So here's a couple of examples. These are up close images at magnification 20 times, 50 times of this material. And this is a thin section image. And what you see in the thin section image is basically angular pieces here, poorly sorted, some sorting possibly vertically this way. And these are, imagine, it's basically all quartz. But the quartz is not rounded. It's not like sand that's nice rounded sand on a beach. This is poorly sorted and not really rounded. It's sub-rounded, it's subangular. And so it turns out that this material is not a rhyolite. It is what I would call a immature silicified sandstone. That's what I've chosen to call it for now. And of course, now the question becomes, where does this mystery material come from? Because now we have it at Kruger II and we have it at Gaudreau. At Gaudreau, it's very important material. At Kruger II, it's less important. And so where does it come from? Well, here's one of the Vermont connections other than the Cheshire quartzite. It turns out that recently there was some archaeological work done in Weybridge, and John Kroc and Jess Robinson mentioned to me that this material resembled a lot the material from Kruger, and they sent me a couple of samples, and I even made a thin section of one piece, and it's a perfect match. In other words, this is the same material. The material at Kruger II is the same material that's being used in the site in Weybridge, except the site in Weybridge seems to be late Archaic, probably maybe Susquehanna, terminal Archaic, something like that. And so at first I thought, well, this material must only be late Paleoindian. Now it turns out it's not. And what's more important is that at Weybridge, there's a lot of this material. It's so much that the archaeologists there assumed that it was a local material. Well, at Kruger, we have quite a bit of it, and at Gaudreau, there's even more of it. And of course, we assumed that it was from Quebec. So the question now is, of course, you know, where is the material from? And I'll get back to this right at the end. So just to recap then, with Kruger II, which like I said, is kind of the best collection because it's the biggest, it's like the one that we can pretty much say it's only late Paleoindian. If we look at Kruger II and the potential sources, here's where the material comes from. So basically what I did is I made a table where I kind of split something up into local, regional, and extra-regional, meaning from more than 500 kilometers. And what you can see is basically that there's a lot of material that's local, coming from river cobbles and veins like the quartz, and some of that red mudstone is local and it's in cobble form. It's definitely used in cobble form sometimes, not often. Then there's a lot of regional material, so material that comes from less than 100 kilometers away, possibly that rhyolite, the Gaudreau immature silicified sandstone, Kineo rhyolite, Montagne de Marbre, which is, I'll show you on the map again, that new quarry of the red material, the local gray mudstone, which almost certainly comes from the same quarry. In fact, we have samples now, we've found samples that have the gray and red. The Hornfels, there's lots of sources of Hornfels in the area, many actually, potential sources. And then again, there's quartz in vein form. So there's actually a lot of local and regional material on this site. And then there's a little bit of non-local material. There's the, so the Kineo rhyolite is definitely non-local. I'm sorry, I was mentioning Montagne de Marbre because there's a lookalike there, so I'll get back to that. But basically, we have Kinyo, which is definitely from 170 kilometers away, which is quite far away. We have Mount Jasper, which is 126, except Mount Jasper, like I said, is barely present. It's just a couple of tools. We have some unknown rhyolites that are probably from further away. Some hornfels that may come from further away, but I think it's local. Cherts that are definitely out from outside the region, but there's not a lot of it. And Cheshire quartzite, but again, like I mentioned, it's only present in a few tools. So the exception really is the Kinyo, and I'll show you why that is. So here's a table where I basically tried to summarize the use of materials by the different tool types. And what I did is I tried to rank them. So I put them in order first of their importance. So bifaces, this is the order of importance in percentage. So going from, Kinyo rhyolite to local red mudstone to Hornfels to Gaudreau rhyolite to the local gray mudstone to a chert, and then there's some undetermined stuff, and then it's quartz, undetermined rhyolite, Cheshire quartzite, and New Hampshire rhyolite. But by then you're talking about 3 or 4 tools at most. And then it did the same thing for the points, put them in order, the drills, put them in order, the unit faces. That's basically scrapers and side scrapers and retouched flakes, the debitage here, and then the global rank. So what I did was then I split them. The colors basically show you red is more than 15% of, let's say, the bifaces, blue is 5 to 15% of the bifaces, and green is less than 5%. And then I created ranks. So what I did is I basically summed up these orders and ranks, and basically in the first rank, in the most important materials are Kinyo rhyolite, the local red mudstone from that quarry, and then a Hornfels, which probably comes from within the region, let's say less than 100 kilometers. In your second rank, in the second group, you have that unknown rhyolite. We don't know where it's from. I would call it now an immature silicified sandstone. The local grade mudstone, which probably comes from that same quarry, that local quarry. Chert, which is probably mostly from outside the region, almost certainly. Quartz, which could be in cobble form or local veins. And then there's a third group, which is this group of material that's really present only in very small numbers, like Cheshire quartzite or New Hampshire rhyolite, but still important because it shows us those connections again to other places to this stuff. So what we're looking at here is essentially Kinyo rhyolite, which is a material that comes from 170 kilometers away, and then some local materials 27 kilometers away, and then some regional materials that are pretty much dominant in almost everything except for example, there are some things in which chert is important. For example, chert is very important for the unifaces, for the scrapers, the side scrapers, the retouch flex. So that's interesting because it shows you that these materials are not necessarily the first choice to make scrapers. And that's actually something that we see quite often when it comes to making scrapers. People want finer materials that are much finer grained. And then there's the debitage. I only used the area 3 debitage here because that was the most carefully analyzed, but you can also look at the ranking for the whole site. But again, the rank for the debitage is pretty close, again, to the rhyolites and this. So in the top rank, you see roughly the same material for the debitage, for example. The cores we can't really talk much about because most of the time, like other than the quartz where there's about 20 cores, everything else there's maybe 1 or 2 cores. So they're ranked like second or third, but really what all that means is that there's 1 or 2 cores of that material. It's not really significant. There's very few cores at this site, which is kind of strange. Okay, so what does this all mean if we try to look at it on a map? So basically, if we try and look at the use of the materials, the first thing that we see is, what I did is I added one other source, this new source of Hornfels that I found this summer. And if we add that in, what we see is that there is a pretty important use of what I would call local to regional materials, especially that red and gray mudstone and some Hornfels. That probably comes from within 50 or maybe, you know, about 50 kilometers of the site. And that includes, you can see Gaudreau is within that ellipse here. So it makes sense that they're kind of in the same gang. The problem at Gaudreau is that they seem to be using primarily that other material that we don't know as far as. But the thing is that this doesn't obviously tell all the whole story, because then we have a lot of Mount Kineo rhyolite. Like, I mean, a lot. It is the #1 material in almost every category except for scrapers. It's even used for drills, it's used for points, it's used for bifaces. And so that's absolutely cannot be ignored. So there's a very strong connection east-west between the people at Gaudreau, Kruger II, and Pleistocene. Remember that they were using that Kineo rhyolite as well, and Mount Kineo. Now, the only little catch here that I'd like to mention is that there is a source here that you see that I've mentioned is Montagne de Marbre. And at Montagne de Marbre, there is rhyolite, and some of that rhyolite is a dead ringer for Mount Kineo. And I was just there a couple of weeks ago. I wasn't able to get up onto the cliff face because it's very dangerous, and it was raining very hard, but I have to go back. I've been there 4 times. And I think that maybe some of the Kineo material may actually come from a more close source, but that's yet to be proven. Ledge Ridge is absolutely not present at any of these sites. Moët-les-Fins is not present. This is another Hornfels that could be present. And then the other connections are to the south with Vermont. There is some Hathaway chert, primarily in the form of a couple of scrapers. There is some Cheshire, like I mentioned, that biface fragment, a scraper. And then there's that material that's found in Weybridge in large amounts. And so the question is, if that material, that unusual material, actually comes from this area of Vermont, let's say, and not from this part of Quebec, then it makes for a much stronger connection down to Vermont. Otherwise, it's just a few objects that are making it back and forth. The problem right now for us is that if you look at Kruger II, it's an unusual site in that it has a lot more variety of tools and a lot more variety of materials. But at the same time, I'm hesitant to say that that a group would go all the way to Kineo within a year, but then also manage to go down, let's say, to Hathaway and partway down Vermont and then come back. It seems to me that another possible way to explain this is that maybe there's 2 groups that meet at Kruger. That's a possibility. Or that maybe Kruger is just a site where people come back to every once in a while, when sometimes they go east-west and sometimes they go north-south. And then Mount Jasper, for example, I've left out because it's only 2 bifaces and a side scraper. And as you know, moving east-west across these mountains is not easy. So it's probably moving this way, and it may have been obtained from another group or somehow through exchange. So it's hard to tell right now. So that's where it's at. There's no absolute conclusive answer to where these people were going and living within the year, but we have a pretty good idea of their area of their territory that they cover, as well as their relationships possibly with other groups in the area. By the way, there's no Mensungen or Round Mountain or Quebec City Church at these sites. So to conclude, the first thing that's interesting is that there's definitely a change in raw material use from the middle to the late Paleoindian, at least at these 3 sites. The late Paleoindians at these sites seem to use a higher proportion of regional sources. So that's really kind of a newer thing, like using all kinds of materials, a lot more Hornfels, a lot of this mudstone, which is not really the best material, but they still managed to make amazing things with it. Hornfels is not an easy material to flint at, by the way. And the reason that, for example, Kruger II happens to be different is that almost all of the other late Paleoindian sites that I've actually been able to work on, whether it's in Gaspé, where I worked at La Marthe and those sites, or the Rimouski site that actually was part of the analysis and the cataloging, or Varney Farm in Maine, and Gaudreau and Clichancourt, these sites almost always focus on 1 or 2 raw materials. In other words, they're really, really, like there's maybe 1 material that is really dominant. Kruger II is very different. In other words, it has all kinds of materials. There's definitely some that are more popular than others, but it has all kinds of materials, a lot of them from within a region, let's say 70 to 80 kilometers. And my suggestion is that it's because this site is an unusual site. In other words, it's either a site that people are coming back to often, but maybe from different areas, or possibly a site where different groups are meeting, using an older term, different bands of Paleoindians that are meeting in this part of southeastern Quebec. Some coming from Vermont, and some coming from further east, like towards Maine and McGann. And that's it. So thank you very much. And I guess time for questions. And I will stop I just want you to thank these people. So I'll let you read that quickly. There's a lot of people to thank, including, of course, John Kroc and Jess Robinson and Jeff Mandel, and some geologists, including my wife, who's a geologist from Vermont. So obviously a lot of people to thank. All right.
Awesome. Well, thank you. So we did have one question come through from Dave Lacey, and I'm going to click the answer live and see. And can you see?
Is it about Cheshire Quartzite?
Can you see those?
By any chance?
I can read them out. At the Kruger II site, did you see spatial clustering, vertically or horizontally, of the many diagnostics? Or alternately, were they all mixed in what appears to be a context with pretty good integrity?
I know this is going to be a disappointing answer, but you'll have to wait for the book. And that's really, the book is literally gone to the printers. And it's at the printers. And if you know Claude Chapdelaine, if you know anything about Claude Chapdelaine, you're going to have it within a month or two because he's unbelievable. So my job was just to tell him where the rocks came from. There is definitely some vertical stratigraphy. They were able to go to, pretty deep, in some cases 1 meter. For us, that's deep. But Kruger II is unusual. That it's kind of like in a rock outcrop, and then there's some places where there's gaps where sort of the fine sediments, like really fine alluvium and possibly even sand, windblown sand. I don't know if they did an analysis, has accumulated, and so that's allowed them to find features even further down. But the problem is that it also limits a bit of the spatial resolution, because sometimes you just literally end up in a place where it's a rock outcrop and then you have no site left, and then you start again. So they've done some spatial analyses of the different areas that they excavated, comparing them, for example, for the debitage and the tools and all that. And then within the couple of places of the site where it's deeper, they've done analyses vertically to see if they can see changes. But honestly, that's out of my expertise. In other words, I've mostly been focusing on the raw materials, but I know that you'll have all those answers soon.
Thank you. So we have a question from Peter Cobb. Do you have a sense of where the manufacturing is taking place, near quarries, at sites, or elsewhere?
Yeah, so in terms of the debitage, I do actually have some pretty good data on the debitage. I mean, there's a lot of biface thinning happening at the site. But what's interesting is that it's, considering the number of bifaces, that's not surprising. There's very few cores. So that's one thing that I mentioned, like other than the 20 quartz cores, which are basically just bashed, bipolar pieces probably. There's literally like, a handful of cores. So there's no cores making it to the site. What they're doing is they're essentially showing up with blanks and preforms, bifacial blanks and preforms, and finishing them. And that includes even that local quarry, the red Mudstone quarry. They are not showing up with blocks. They're not showing up with, I'd say, even relatively advanced preforms. In other words, they're definitely showing up with blanks, but I'd say even more so with pretty decent preforms. And the only thing that I wasn't able to do, because I do a lot of technological analysis myself, but the way that the project was organized, I wasn't able to do this. But essentially, what in North America, unfortunately, we tend to kind of separate debitage from tools. And of course, in the European tradition, you don't do that. And you know, you have one analyst do one and then somebody else do the other. And the thing is that when you can integrate the two, what we need to do is, for example, look at, you know, in terms of the raw materials, separate out each chaîne opératoire for each raw material, look at what stage of, you know, the biface, if you want to use Callahan's stage, let's say, of reduction, it shows up on the site, right? But for example, one very interesting thing that I mentioned in my chapter is we have no clue what the chaîne opératoire is. In other words, the sequence that leads to the production of those drills. Okay, I can pretty much figure out how those big bifaces, those big, wide, flat bifaces made out of mudstone, hornfels, kineo-rhyolite, or look-alike are made, because they're classic. There's those super flat flakes, very wide flakes. We understand that. We understand how that makes it on to further steps, even towards the parallel flake points, because we've studied that at places like La Marthe, where we've got the quarries and the workshops, and we have the whole sequence, and we've studied it in detail. Manik Kolatkar has written a 700-page PhD on it, if you're interested in it. So we understand that part, but how do you do the drills? There are dozens and dozens and dozens of drills, and I don't see the step before that at this site. I'd love to know, for example, what they show up with at the site to make those drills, for example. And they're nothing, by the way, like the drills at Bullbrook. I was part of the Bullbrook study with Brian Robinson and Jen Ort, and I saw those drills. They're totally different. They're a completely different thing. These are basically bifacial pieces that are narrowed down, but there's so many. It's crazy. And they're making out of hornfels too, and kineo. It's crazy. They're making it out of. The only thing they don't use to make the drills is the mudstone, which is interesting.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Another question from Dave Lacey. Do you have any insight or speculation about the relative territoriality of lithic/quarry sources?
I mean, I think I know where Dave's going with this. In terms of access or limited access or controlling access. No, I don't think I can make a statement on that. One thing that still stumps me is kineo-rhyolite, if it's kineo-rhyolite, is like, I mean, it's dominant, truly dominant at the site, Kruger II, and also at Clichancourt, by the way, for the late Paleo. But for example, when I did a geochemical analysis of a whole bunch of other rhyolites at Clichancourt, I had a pretty good match for Montagne de Marbre. And I also have this lookalike at Montagne de Marbre. So if that changes, and I eventually have to conclude that it's not kineo, but this other rock, then I could say, well, yeah, maybe that's their material. That's their signature material. It's like the Gaudreau stuff is that other signature material, and maybe they control access to it because, for example, kineo we find everywhere, but the Gaudreau material I have seen it only at 2 other sites in my life. There is one large rock-lar at Crown Point in that mixed Paleoindian site on the New York side, just across from Vermont. And there's one biface in La Colle, which I found in a collection, an old collection made out of that material. And it is a late Paleo biface found at La Colle. And La Colle, as you know, is literally on the border with New York and Vermont. It is the border crossing. And then there's some, obviously the material at Weybridge, but in terms of Paleo stuff, there's only 2 other tools, to my knowledge, found to date. So there is possibly a kind of a signature material, like that Weybridge material or Gaudreau material, call it whatever, or possibly this kineo type material for late Paleoindians. But in terms of accessibility or limiting access, no idea.
Thank you. A question from Daniel Cassidy asking if you could recap again what artifact forms were represented in the Mount Jasper material.
2 large bifaces, 1 large side scraper. And I would not be surprised if we find the other parts of that biface eventually, because there's almost no flakes of it. But I think somehow they got their hands on two really nice big bifaces and one large skyscraper. You can tell that it's a nice huge flake blank, maybe coming off of a large biface as well, but that's it.
Awesome. So a question from Jess Robinson. Thank you so much, Adrian. I could ask a million questions, but one I would ask that might take you out of your comfort zone is, what do you make of the fairly stark movement from the chert?
Yeah, I mean, they don't abandon chert. They still use it for the scrapers and stuff, and they still seem to really like it for some stuff. I did identify some cherts that were definitely Appalachian cherts, because they have the radiolaria and they have the bioturbation, and they're. But the problem is that, you know, they could be from a whole bunch of places. But I'm pretty sure that a couple of them could very likely come from Hathaway. It would make sense. But the problem, I also found a couple that had fossils that would place them in southern Ontario or New York. So there's a couple of pieces that are coming from further away. But why do they just give up on Munsungan, for example, when they're at Kineo? I mean, there's like, you know, I don't get it. I don't really understand it. There's no other good source of chert nearby. So there's a chert at Mont-Éléphant, which you probably saw on the map. That chert's not great, and I almost never find it on our sites. There's Ledge Ridge, not present. So there is a piece of Ledge Ridge chert at Gaudreau, but it's in an archaic form. Very interesting. One piece. And as you know, I was able to demonstrate that there was no Ledge Ridge at Clichy-Cancourt, none, that's published. And I've sampled Ledge Ridge like nobody's ever sampled Ledge Ridge. I mean, it'll be published soon. I sent it for publication. I don't know when it's gonna come out, but I mean, that stuff's not there. So there are cherts that we know about that are local or regional that are not used, and for a while, they're crazy about Munsungan, and then it just drops off of the face of the earth. But they seem to still like to have the odd piece from the Appalachians. I guess it could come from Quebec City, but it doesn't match the samples that I have from Quebec City. I think it's coming from the south. I think it's coming from Vermont, and then maybe a couple of pieces from further west, and that's it. But I think it's really mostly in the scrapers. The odd drill. There's one drill that I can think of, and there are 2 point bases that are notched at Kruger II that are made out of a black chert with radiolaria in it.
Awesome. Thank you. So we have a question from Angela at Labrador. Do you plan to continue researching the lingering questions of the east-west and north-south connections at Kruger II? If so, what are your next steps to help refine this?
Well, one of the steps was I was supposed to go to Vermont and keep looking for that material. I mean, John Kroc and I spent a day near Weybridge. It happens to be really close to where my wife's from, Bristol, so it was easy. Right next to Field Days, if any of you have been ever to Addison County Fair, it's literally right there. And I think there's some good potential. I've looked at the geology and looked at it, and I did a whole transect. I started at Lake Champlain, south of Burlington, and followed a bunch of outcrops and got some samples that look good. But to be honest, that's what we have to do. It's just more field work. And it's the same, like that's what I did just a few weeks ago in Eastern Townships. I have to go back to Montagne de Marbre. Every time I go there, it's just like, I think I'm never gonna make it out of there alive. It's really scary. I have to go back to Scottstown. I have a really good feeling about that Hornfels source. I think there might be a quarry there. We have to spend more time at that new quarry, the Red Mudstone quarry. And then, you know, Kineo we know pretty well. And thanks to work by our colleagues in Maine and also Ian Putnam, who did his master's on it, I think we have a good handle about Kineo, you know, and Brassois and Blue Ridge. But then if I go to Montagne de Marbre and I found something that's exactly the same, then that's going to be tougher. And when I compared it geochemically, the two, I was able to tell them apart. So if I actually find a good outcrop and a quarry, and then we can properly sample it, then I'll have an answer to that question. And then of course, the other thing is we just have to hope that somebody in Vermont, a navigational archaeologist, somebody who's just super keen, a geologist who just says, wow, yeah, that's a weird rock. I think I've seen that. Just literally by sheer luck says, yeah, I can take you where that rock is from, because that's how we're going to find it. I could walk around in the woods for the next 50 years. I'm sure I won't find it, but I like walking around in the woods though, so it's good.
Thank you. A question from Jesse Liang. For thin sections, do you analyze them by appearance or composition as well to determine the raw material?
So I thin section almost always the geological samples standard. I just do it as a standard procedure. I think it's a really good idea. You learn so much about a rock when you thin section it. And that's what geologists do. They do it always as a first step. And then sometimes to do the geochemistry, I'll do it, I can do on a polished rock sample like for the XRF, or I can take the thin section itself and polish it and look at it under the SEM, the microprobe, or the sanding electron microscope, and I can sort of look at the minerals and zap them individually. I don't always need to really go to that level. Most of these rocks are just silica. They have almost nothing to see in them other than some structures and maybe radiolaria, maybe. So the geochemistry primarily is done sort of on larger rock samples that we polish. And then when we have to do the artifact, since we don't want to cut up the artifact, we analyze the artifacts as is, and we compare the geochemistry non-destructively using the XRF. But the thing is that, for example, for Kruger, I wasn't able to do that. But I feel pretty good about the visual identifications. And what I've been doing in the last few years in my publications is I try to provide enough photos and enough description so that anybody with a basic microscope of 20 to 30, X, can, if they have a sample next to them, if they have an actual rock sample next to them of that source, should be able to match them. You don't need the geochemistry, you don't need the thin section. I do the thin section because it helps me to explain to people what they see in the rock, like that silicified, that sandstone. Like when you look at it in thin section, it's like, oh yeah, I get it. It's like so obvious. The whole story is right there. And then it kind of helps us to go back and look in the right place. Because I've done a lot of field work looking for that rock in Quebec, by the way, days and days in Quebec as well, found nothing. So now I sort of go back to the geologists, I talk to them again. I say, okay, now that we think it's this, can you send me in, and they send me in another direction. But yeah, I think that most of the work that most of us do, I think we can do with just a good comparative collection and a good microscope, and just like in the case of this publication for Kruger II, you'll have all kinds of photos. There's like dozens and dozens of photos of different, magnifications that I think you'll be able to recognize a rock pretty quickly. Like if you see that and that together, it's that rock. Okay, good. So.
Awesome. Well, that's all the questions that are in the Q&A. I'm not sure if there's any more that are coming my way or not, but that answers all the questions I had. I just want to take a moment again to thank you very much for all of this. This was a fascinating presentation and a great lecture. I do look forward to the book being released. That seems exciting.
It is in French.
I'll have to get my dictionary back out from high school.
I can't pronounce French, but I can read it.
Okay.
Awesome. Yvonne, do you have any closing thoughts?
No, that was wonderful though. Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome. And thanks to you. Thanks to everybody that showed up. I see some names that I recognize and some that I don't. Certainly it'd be nice to meet you in person sometime and go have a beer, some great Vermont beer. I miss it. My sip of sunshine and all those things, but
well, if next year is a little bit different, maybe this will be an in-person and you can come back for part 2 of this lecture at a brewery or something like that.
Exactly. That sounds like a good idea.
Awesome.
All right. Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you.